Welcome to a new Congregational Library History Talk. I'm Dr. Frank Bremer. Today's discussion will be between Dr. Stephen Ray and Dr. Cornelia Dayton. Dr. Stephen Ray is the recently retired president of the Chicago Theological Seminary and the immediate past president of the Society for the Study of Black Religion. In addition to having served in a variety of academic positions, he was the project historian and curator for the Hartford Black History Project. Stephen is an ordained minister in the United Church of Christ and has served in several pastorates. He's a member of the Congregational Library Board of Directors. Dr. Cornelia Dayton is a member of the History Department at the University of Connecticut. She is an expert in early American history and the author of numerous works, including Women Before the Bar, Gender, Law, and Society in Connecticut, 1639 to 1789. Today's discussion will focus on her essay, Lost Years Recovered, John Peters and Phillis Wheatley Peters in Middleton, which won the 2020 Walter Muir Whitehill Prize of the New England Quarterly. And Stephen, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Well, let me say what a pleasure it is to talk with you, Dr. Dayton, and let me commend you for a truly excellent article. It was a very, very significant contribution, and I just found it compelling and engaging. Why don't we begin our conversation? And let me ask you, what attracted your attention to Phillis Wheatley and her husband?
Well, thank you for having this conversation, Dr. Ray. I look forward to it. For me, it was a serendipitous find. One of the hats I wear is as a legal historian, so I troll through lots and lots of legal papers from Massachusetts and Connecticut in the 18th century, early 19th century. So I am not a biographer of Phillis Wheatley, but I came across a contested will case, a probate case, where I recognized her husband's name, John Peters. And we've known very little about John Peters, so I knew that this was valuable, and it led after more research to a cache of 120 legal papers, all of which illuminate a major question that we haven't known about the poet Phillis Wheatley, which is where did she and her husband, her new husband, John Peters, go when they left Boston for 3 years? So these papers are about Middleton, Massachusetts, a small interior town in Essex County, north of Boston, and their attempt to build a successful life there, which was dashed by neighbors and white people's hostility, and the papers also show us the backstory, the origin story, or some of it, of her husband, John Peters.
Okay, excellent, excellent. You know, a question that occurs to me, certainly in research that I've done in the past, one of the big challenges is often when you are researching African Americans in New England, it's hard to find resources, not because they're hidden, but because people often don't feel the need to identify them as such. So in your research, how did you navigate that difficulty of recognizing that there is some kind of racial element going on here, but just in terms of how people are recording the history, very rarely do they just identify that as the out front thing that's happening.
No, this is a continuing problem, but I think we're making strides in a way in tracking the life stories of individual Black New Englanders and in learning more about communities and clusters of people in each county or in particular towns. But you're right, you have to kind of start with some knowledge that that person has African heritage, identifies with the Black community, because usually in the late 18th century, so after the Revolution, the court records do not indicate a perceived racial identity. Earlier, they often would. They would say a free Black man, Um, and some people can sort of tell by names if a person was moving from an enslavement to free status. Sometimes they kept the names that enslavers had given them, like a name like Cato, um, or Primus, and so
Mm-hmm.
those names might jump out at us as someone likely to be African in origin, but other names are sound like English settlers.
Mm-hmm.
So you'd have to keep triangulating among the records and come up with your own list. And some people suggest starting with the 1790 census, and more mapping is going on using those lists, which supposedly identify the head of household by perceived race. But it's hard, it's difficult, but I
Mm-hmm.
think it's worthwhile.
Yes, indeed, indeed. I have to admit, and here I will betray that I am a Netflix subscriber, is that as I was reading this story, I couldn't help but think about Bridgerton, the phenomena of a few
Yeah,
years back. And
right.
there was a particular scene where Lord Hastings was talking to his son, and
Hmm.
he told him, you
Mhm.
have to at once be powerful, but then walk very lightly because they can take all of this away from us.
Mhm.
And it struck me that John Peters
Mhm.
might have missed the walking lightly part.
Huh, huh, huh. Right. Well, I mean, as so many figures in history, but in this case particularly, I think he's a really interesting mix of ability, skill, competencies, and I hesitate to kind of assume that we know his temperament. Um, but clearly, there was conflict between John Peters and members of this blended household he moved his family into in Middleton, which included a white widow, his former enslaver, and the free black woman, Dinah Cover, who stuck with the widow as her companion, perhaps because of personal loyalty, but probably because of a sizable legacy that was coming to her if she was faithful. So there are tensions, I think you're getting at. We see in the depositions between these three people. But I think of Skip Gates's book, 10 Ways to Look at a Black Man,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so I think I, especially as an interpreter, need to be very careful. Um, I I don't want to reflexively assume, well, John Peters had a temper. He got into rages. Because the more I think about the incidents that are being described, um, um, surely there was something that we don't hear about in the testimony that triggered his rage, and I think perhaps it was protecting his wife and his possibly an infant child. Um, so, this issue of did he rub people the wrong way? We could also read him as an entrepreneur
Mm-hmm.
who puts on many vocational hats, right? As trader, shopkeeper, a farmer, later in life, lawyer, physician, um, and all of that is fascinating, I think, and shows his sort of multi-talented entrepreneurial nature.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that is just right because in terms of how the documents that you identified talked about him, as I read it, he was simply a man looking for the respect of his station in life, and which was something that his larger society was not willing to recognize. So another question I have for you is that in my work, I've largely gone from the Black community and then discover things about individuals as a consequence. Your
Mhm,
work is sort of going the other way, right? You're
mhm,
beginning with a story about an
mhm,
individual
mhm. Right,
that then may shine light on what's
right.
happening in the larger context. As you think about doing that work, if you're going to talk to someone who's, let's say, beginning to want to discover some of this underexamined history,
Mhm.
what advice would you give them if they were really going to start looking at individuals as opposed to starting from a community and then sussing out what's going on with the individuals in that community.
Well, one piece of advice is to examine, I think, all the details that you find. So, just thinking about John Peters, who I'm considering writing a short biography, a book-length biography of
Hmm.
Peters, because some people have urged that. So I've been sketching it out in my mind recently, and even though I uncovered a lot of documents that relate to his life, and Vincent Coretta, the wonderful biographer of Phillis Wheatley, has done so too, there are there are details. This is my answer to your question that should be followed up on. So, for instance, one thing is, I'm just going to look at it here. We have his probate inventory for when he died in Charleston, Massachusetts in 1801. And like any probate inventory, if you bring real scrutiny to it, every item, and you try to imagine what was the material world of this individual, why did he choose to have certain objects in his possession? Um, uh, and sometimes you have to like seek out the experts, right, who know about farm utensils and specialized things. But um, John Peters, for instance, was a man who liked horses. We learn this through the depositions. People criticize him actually for keeping too many horses. So that was one way in which he aspired to gentlemanly status, and there were others too. But so he owns. I'm not sure if at his death he owns a horse, but just before that, yes, one sorrel horse, one suki, which is a kind of a carriage and harness, a sleigh, and then does the person own certain objects that aren't just everyday objects, but are what we used to call luxury objects, or
Hmm.
the looking glass, the pictures on the wall. The He owns a silver mounted clothes horse.
Mm.
I can imagine what that means to put your, fine white shirts on, but I'd love to know more about that. So following up on the details in this kind of way, and then one other way I think is there are lots of financial accounts that are hidden or tied up in these legal cases, and from those you can start to connect Peters to everyone, to lots of people he knew and was indebted to or traveled to go see, like the lawyers in Newburyport or Salem. And, there are people today who can do sort of sophisticated mapping, right? But I think following up on what seemed at first to be trivial, mundane details, this is sort of what the famous Pulitzer Prize winning author Laurel Ulrich did with Martha Ballard's diary in Maine. I think it pays off to follow details. And I'm always curious about who are the other people? What are their biographies? Who John Peters and Phillis Wheatley Peters knew, right?
Hmm.
So you start to build that kind of network.
Hmm. As you were just talking, I was thinking about a discovery that we made back in the '90s. That one of the ways you could identify someone in the Black community as being
Mhm.
a significant community leader was that they had more than two or three chairs in their house,
Awesome. Right.
because they
Right.
were a person who used their home to convene
Right.
numbers of people. And so you could
Yes.
look at the number of chairs and that would give
Yes.
you a hint as
Yes.
to the person's place within their community. So no, I think that
That
that's
makes sense.
exactly right. That is exactly right. So let me ask you another question in terms of easily overlooking information. And what I mean by that is that unlike some who engage in conspiracy theories, people weren't trying to hide history back then. I mean, they told,
Mhm.
and they told what was going on, and frequently you could overlook
Mhm.
some significant sorts of things. So I know you said look at a range of things, but if you were to identify a place that someone would begin, so
Mhm.
and what I mean by a place that someone would begin, uh, where would you lead them to? Would you lead them to the county courthouse? Would you lead them to the records at the first church or whatever town it was?
Mhm. No, it's a great question. I mean, I myself, spend a lot of time with court records, so I am a big fan of using court records. Um, but um, but by the end of the 18th century, the civil courts can be pretty boring because there might be 200 or 300 cases, and
Hmm.
in the big record books, and there are none of the details, right? So you really only get details if the case is contested and you have these loose file papers, and so you have to move back and forth between them, and that can be difficult. Some are digitized, the books are digitized, the file papers aren't. Um, so it can be daunting. I mean, we at the beginning of my career, I was doing this for women, mostly white women, who came into the New Haven County court system, and no one had really ever tried to track in practice how many women were in the New England County courts. And up until then, most legal historians who were male had assumed there were very few women, and it wasn't worth pursuing. But 10 to 25% of litigants were women, it turns out. So it was worth pursuing. um, so, I mean, but certain kinds of legal records are fascinating, like divorces.
Hmm.
And I feel that the divorces in early 19th century Massachusetts have not been studied in great detail. And Connecticut has far more divorces. So those in this period are not boilerplate petitions. They're handwritten and they tell fascinating stories. So I would begin for stories. I would begin with divorce records.
Hmm. Hmm. Another thing that struck me in your article was just the amount of geographic and social mobility that was going on, not just in the story, but it was going on in this rapidly evolving society that was becoming
Mhm.
an independent nation.
Mhm.
I mean, could you say a little bit about that? In some ways, I chuckled because I thought that many of them traveled farther in this story than people who live
Mhm.
in those small New England towns do even today.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, I think I'd like to use another example,
Hmm.
which is Abijah and Lucy Prince, who the wonderful English professor Gretchen Gruzina has written a wonderful book about, which I think is called Mr. and Mrs. Prince. But their struggles remind me of John Peters and Phillis Wheatley Peters' struggles. And my curiosity is in how many rural towns did Black landowners face harassment? So the princes moved from the Pioneer Valley in Massachusetts, the Hadley area, I think, to Guilford, Vermont, so up the Connecticut River, and were successful small farmers there in their 70s. And it wasn't the town in this case, but an eccentric white man from Stonington, Connecticut, moved opposite them, built a house that people at the time called pretentious, and began to deliberately harass the princes, even hiring thugs to and I guess this is a kind of traditional rural bad act is to turn the prince's own pigs and livestock onto their garden and their crops, and this happened twice. Um, and The famous story is that Lucy Prince went to the Vermont Supreme Court and petitioned the Supreme Court for help, and they insisted that the town defend the princes from their neighbor, John Noyes. So in that case, the town backed up the princes, but then they moved again. So this speaks to the mobility, Dr. Ray, that you're getting at. They moved to Sunderland, Vermont, and started as landowners there and gave that land to their sons. So that's a internal New England migration story. Um, we don't have their letters and diaries, so we don't know what their thinking was. Um, but there was great deal of movement within New England, and of course from New England to the Western Reserve and what
Mm-hmm.
is now Ohio and up into Vermont, New Hampshire.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So let me ask one question. I don't think it'll be the last, but we are coming close to our time. Is what would you think that people can get from this article in understanding how race was working in that time? And what I mean by that is that, during that time, particularly the last quarter of the 18th century, it was really evolving in terms of what these categories would mean, whether or not someone was black, who was white, how do you think about people in between? So it was really an unstable, even though there was some stability. What might we learn about how it was working at that time?
That's a really important question, I think, and I'm not sure I've worked it out in my own mind. Um, I mean, I think people could debate what were the major factors in why John Peters' time as a farmer and landowner of 110 acres in this small, somewhat impoverished town of Middleton, why was it not successful? Why couldn't he stick with it? My own sense is it wasn't his own doing, but he'd gotten himself into a very peculiar legal situation where he had written a deed promising to give 110 acres back to the widow, his former enslaver, if he didn't support her for the rest of her life. So they made that bargain. And then when their friendship or alliance ruptured, she wouldn't let him support him for the rest of his life. So is that because he's a black man and she turns against him, and her associate Dinah Cubber seems to have a hatred for John Peters, but his brother Snow Francis, who is involved and a neighbor in all of this, but not particularly wealthy, it's not clear where Snow Francis stands. So we don't really know John Peters' relationship with his three brothers who live in Middleton, who have a different surname, or with the black community in Boston later on or before. Um, and I think that white racial prejudice was a factor, and it was a very important structural factor because a talented man like John Peters, who did become a substantial landowner, um, he wasn't able to acquire citizenship status, right, in a New England town. He wasn't allowed to serve in town offices. A friend of mine, a historian, has pointed out there weren't any formal rules at this point that said that, but that was long time custom. Or serve on juries. He wasn't ever called. So I would say he wasn't able to prove his usefulness to the town, even though he was somewhat of an outsider. Although, of course, we think he grew up there as an enslaved boy. So I think it's a vexed question, and that's why I would like to see more research done on parallel cases in New England, the Northeast, to see were there successful black landowners who moved into towns and were able to persist. What does that success look like?
Mm-hmm.
And how many moved on, like the Princess did, looking for a better situation?
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for that. I mean, I think that that's the kind of questions that allow us to get inside the intricacies of history and not simply assume that we are knowing exactly what we're dealing with simply because we're dealing with black people, white people, and indigenous people, that we know exactly what's happening. That asking how these identities are at work, I think, open the story, not close it, but actually open the story for us to be able to dig more deeply. So I think that our time has come to an end, but I do want to thank you once again for such an excellent article, and thank you for a wonderful conversation.
Well, this has been terrific, and I look forward to more conversations in the future.
Okay. And thank you again, both, for, I think, a very stimulating conversation. And I hope that this will prompt many of the people who watch this to find Dr. Dayton's article in the New England Quarterly and read it for themselves, because we've only been able to touch upon some of the highlights of the story. Thank you both very much.